flood. Before we, as part of what we're going to do, if anybody wants to chime in, I guess they can with the chat, and then you could let us know and we can do questions at the end, or if we need to stop at any point, you know, we're fine with doing that as well. And he's going to start out talking just more general about some of the different flood information, and then we'll go into some other specifics at some point. So I'm going to mute and let him get started.
All right, just to start off, as y'all may know, Onslow County does participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Onslow County also participates in the CRS system, which is the community rating system. This is a voluntary program that we participate in order to, you know, lower insurance, flood insurance for citizens in the county. Being a CRS community, you know, you have to adopt some additional standards in addition to what FEMA requires. That's mainly what separates CRS communities from just simply communities that comply with FEMA requirements. So in Onslow County, we do have 5 predominant flood zones. We have Zone X. We have the Shaded X, which is also known as the AE flood zone. We have, we have the Coastal A zone, the AE zone, and the VE zone. So Zone X, which is an unregulated flood zone, it is the area beyond the 500-year floodplain. The Shaded X, which is going to appear as the yellow flood zone whenever you look on our county GIS maps, that is the flood zone that has a 0.2% annual chance of flood. Now, we don't require any kind of flood permits for development here. There's not any kind of elevation requirements in the Shaded X. But, you know, one thing to really keep in mind with that Shaded X is just because you're in the unregulated floodplain, that you're in the Shaded X, the yellow zone, you're not immune from flooding. We saw several properties that flooded in the Shaded X and even in Zone X after Florence. So moving from Shaded X into AE, this is the regulated flood zone. This is where homes are required to have that elevation certificate whenever they decide to build there. This is also known as the 100-year flood zone, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later as how people can really be misled on what exactly is the 100-year flood zone. But in the AE, you know, of course, you have to meet the BFE requirements. Any kind of enclosures below BFE, you have to have your flood vents, things of that nature. Something new that has just been implemented on the new flood maps that became effective June 19th is what's known as the Coastal A zone. And this is determined by the Limwa line. The Coastal A is still considered to be in the AE flood zone, but there's Coastal A restrictions on it. So what that means is this Coastal A zone, it extends from where the VE zone ends to a point that's determined by FEMA based off of, you know, models that they have ran. And in this zone, you're subject to velocity waves, whereas in AE, in a regular AE, you're not determined to be subject to velocity waves. Not saying that it can't happen, but you're just not, you haven't been zoned that way. This Coastal A zone requires you to meet VE construction standards due to the fact that you are subject to those velocity waves. In addition to, you have to meet the AE standards, which is going to include providing a flood vent as well. And that's something new. And we're seeing that, you know, a lot of properties are falling into this zone, and there's been some confusion as far as what's required on this. And then getting into the last flood zone that we see here in the county is the VE zone. this is your coastal high hazard flood zone where you're subject to velocity waves that are 3 feet and greater. You know, in the VE, you have to meet our elevation requirement where the lowest horizontal member of the structure must be above our regulatory flood protection elevation. Any enclosures must have the breakaway wall. You have to have a V-zone certificate for construction in the V-zone. And something new that, you know, we're requiring in our new ordinance and that, you know, we're encouraging everybody to do is that non-conversion agreement, which goes into any areas below your BFE that they're not to be converted into livable space. And that's going to, you know, protect future homeowners and current homeowners by not going back in and converting a space that's not going to allow the home to be FEMA compliant. To finish off, I do just want to talk about the 100-year flood a little bit. So the 100-year floodplain is that's the AE zone. That's where your regulations begin, and it refers to a flood that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. And I hear it all the time. I'm in the 100-year floodplain. That means that I'm only supposed to get a flood every 100 years, and that's simply not the case. You could have a 100-year flood twice in 1 year. You could have a 100-year flood 4 times in 1 year. You could have it, you know, for no amount of times in 10 years. Just to give you a odd that FEMA provides is another way to look at the flood risk is to think of a 100-year flood will happen sometime during the life of a 30-year mortgage. There's a 26% chance for that 100-year flood in 30 years compared to, you know, with a house fire, there's only a 1 to 2% chance. So are there any questions on what I've gone over so far?
That's in the chat if anybody wants to unmute to ask any questions if they have any.
All right, well, if you think, I'm sorry, we lose power in here?
We got to move around.
Oh, we have an automatic light here, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
When does this, has this already gone into effect? I'm kind of new to the area.
Sure, so
Like, how does this affect our elevation certificates?
I'm sorry, what was that?
How does this affect our elevation certificates?
You can turn your volume down. So the new flood maps went into effect and were adopted by Onslow County on June 19th, 2020. So for homes that are currently there, for elevation certificates that you currently have on homes that are in existence, those are fine. The new elevation certificates are required for new construction. We're also seeing cases where homes that weren't in the flood zone that have now been added to it, insurance companies are requiring those elevation certificates to be able to determine, you know, what rate they're going to, you know, apply on that insurance for them. But as far as a new elevation certificate, that's only required for new construction or in addition to the home may require one.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We did have one in the chat. What is the difference in preliminary flood zones versus established flood zones for likeliness to flood?
Okay, so we currently don't have I guess we do have preliminary maps that haven't been adopted in certain areas of the county yet. And then, so going back to before this new flood zone was adopted, where we had the effective and we had the preliminary, the only difference is that the county can't legally enforce the requirements from that preliminary zone until it's officially been adopted. But you know, and we still encouraged a lot of people, whenever we have that preliminary data available, And it's a strong indicator that FEMA's predicting these areas to have a high hazard of flooding. So, you know, it's definitely not a bad idea to build to those preliminary standards. So whenever they are adopted, you're in compliance then. But we can't enforce on the preliminary maps. But, you know, that doesn't mean that the flood's not going to go there, because they're already forecasting that to be an area that's highly susceptible to flooding.
Okay, so I guess a follow-up to that. So what does it mean then to be preliminary flood zones? Does it mean that it has shown flooding or might at some point?
So if you're in the preliminary, and it shows that you're in an effective flood zone, but if you're in the preliminary and it shows you in the regulated flood zone, but the effective flood maps show that you're not in the flood zone, you're going to be held to the standards under those effective maps. So you wouldn't have to meet any flood requirements. Now, if you want to meet the preliminary requirements, so whenever they are adopted, you'll be compliant, that's your option. If they're showing it to be in a preliminary zone, that means that one of their scientific models they've ran at FEMA, and I don't know how they come up with those, but it's telling you there's a good chance that area will flood. But you're not required to meet any requirements of a preliminary zone until it's adopted.
Okay, and another one, I've noticed a historic flood zone and an effective flood zone. What is the historic flood zone telling us?
Okay, so Angie is going to get into the historic flood zone and what purpose that's still serving.
Turn up my volume. You need to turn yours down. Okay, good morning. So probably 90% of our flood maps were adopted and became effective June 19th, 2020. There's still some areas along Burgall Highway out toward Duplin and Pender counties that haven't been adopted because the flood panels are, in squares, and so they don't really match county boundaries, which is kind of unfortunate, but it is what it is. And then there's also areas near Stella that have not been adopted yet and are still showing. And that's why we've got these different areas on Go Maps. I am going to see if I am able to share my Go Maps screen with you. And I don't know where I thought I saw that share screen.
At the bottom where the bar is. There you are.
Well, that's me, but then where's my...
So we can see your screen now.
Can you?
Yeah,
okay,
cool.
Yeah,
you're on.
All right. So I pulled up an address because I wanted to show you a few things from Go Maps because we do have some maps that are still preliminary. We had to keep that as a layer. So if you go to the layers, and I'm just going to kind of show you some of this so you can see what we've done. So this is an area of the county, Hubert area, that do have the effective maps now. And so I've clicked the effective June 19th, 2020, and you can see that the flood maps. So if I were to unclick that and click on the preliminary, what you're gonna see is this just kind of grayed out. That means there's not any preliminary maps now. We're using those new effective maps, okay? And then but on the historic, you could go and see what it used to be. So we felt like that was a useful thing to have for permitting and possibly for you guys as well, for folks, but mostly you're not going to use that much, but that's why that historic is there. Those were the maps that were just replaced by these new ones that were adopted on June 19th. So I'm going to go back to the preliminary, to the effective on this property and I picked this property because it shows the coastal A zone. the, if you ever use the state site, the NC Frizz, the Limwa, your internet connection is unstable. There it's showing up. It's coming up later. We're in a conference room, so we're not connected. We're wireless. So that Limwa line, can you see it now, Austin? It's the little dash line that you see, and what you see towards the VE area from that is the AE zone that's now hashed looking, and that's actually the coastal A zone. And we've also have that layer coastal A zone, and I'm going to click it, and it's going to take a minute to come on, but it's that kind of red, scary looking area. But that's that coastal A zone in these new maps. So as Austin was saying, in the coastal A zone, the building requirements, if it's a new building, is that they have to meet the VE standards, the engineered plans, the elevation being referenced by the lowest horizontal member, and any enclosure walls have to be breakaway walls, but they also have to have flood vents. And the reasoning behind that, the theory behind that in the flood world is that those areas are subject to high velocity flood waters that would need the breakaway walls, but it's also subject to just rising flood waters, and that's where the flood vents would come into play. Yeah. So in terms of our new ordinance, so we adopted the new state model ordinance when we adopted the maps, and those became effective June 19th. We maintained the 2-foot freeboard that the county has had since it's been part of the NFIP program. And the other higher standard that we adopted this time is a non-conversion agreement. And that was one of the documents that was shared with you earlier. And what that is for properties that have an enclosed space that's under the elevation requirement, that are only supposed to be used for parking and storage, limited storage, and not supposed to be finished spaces. This non-conversion agreement is required to be recorded before there's a CO for that property. And then that means that that's going to follow the chain of title for that property. That's basically just another piece of information for property owners to know they can't finish that space. We've had a couple of cases in the last year or two where we've had to go to a property because they had a permitting question, or we had a property that was being listed for sale, and a real estate agent had called and asked about this enclosed space, but yet it wasn't reflected on the elevation certificate. And we've had to go and do a flood violation and require people to tear out that finished space. Got to move around again. So those are not fun conversations to have, and they're pretty costly for property owners. And we feel like that this non-conversion agreement that's recorded is going to protect that property owner from doing that. And then really, you know, as a realtor, I think it's going to help you guys too. And we'd like to encourage that if you've got any new properties that are being listed for sale, that you really consider talking to that seller about recording that agreement from the beginning. Because, you know, what happens, people buy a property, well, nobody told me I couldn't finish this space. Well, if it's recorded in part of that chain of title, you know, they can still say that, certainly, but I think it provides a layer of protection for that seller, for you as a real estate agent, and really, hopefully it's going to keep people from doing that, because that's like I said, has been a problem recently. Any questions about the map? Do we have any chat questions that came in? Can you see the screen? So this yellow area, of course, is that shaded X that Austin spoke about. The regular blue is the AE. The hashed area is that coastal A zone, which is also the part of the AE. And then the green is the VE. I'm going to go to another property to show you where it's got some of the older maps still listed and show you how you can see that. So this property, you can see the AE flood zone and the yellow part. But if you go up here to the ID button, go highlight that property, and then go to the effective flood map and go to the A zone. Down at the bottom, what you're going to see is the A zone, the panel, but you're going to see the effective date field. And that shows that that map is still under that November 2nd, 2005. So in that area, which is a tool or a indicator that there's also a preliminary map available. So if we change the map layers for this area and go to a preliminary, we're going to see that it's not grayed out, but there are some preliminary maps available, and you can then go to that preliminary and go to that same spot and see what the flood zone is proposed there. But still, it shows that they're still under the effective maps of 2005. So we wanted to show you where there are still some preliminary maps that are out there. It's kind of, like I said, this is near Stella, and then there's some along Burgall Highway near Maple Hill in that area, but most all of the Swansboro, Hubert area and Sneads Ferry, they're all under the new effective maps with this June 19th date. One of the other things that I wanted to share with you is that, you know, after Hurricane Florence, we learned a lot of things. We learned that there were a lot of flooding in areas where there were newer homes. They were built to the effective flood standard, and people were surprised by that. They felt like they should have been protected. And what we tell people, and you guys know as well, that, you know, floodwaters don't know where the BFE is, nor do they know where the flood line is. And you never know how a storm's going to hit and what the impacts are going to be. So, you know, we encourage and encourage you to encourage your clients to have everybody get flood insurance. One of the things they say is that, you know, if it rains at your house, you could flood. And if you're not in a regulated floodplain, those insurance premiums are relatively low when you think about how much it costs for even an inch of water that might go into your home. You're going to spend thousands of dollars to repair not just the floors, but sheetrock. And so I think encouraging people to get flood insurance is something that we try to stress to property owners, and you certainly can do the same. One of the other things about flood insurance when people are taking out those policies is to encourage them to talk to their agent about the ICC coverage. It's kind of like a rider on the flood insurance policies that provide extra money for people to come into compliance. So in other words, if their home was not elevated to the current flood requirement and they're substantially damaged, part of their repairs are they're going to have to elevate that home. And that ICC coverage provides extra funding to help. The ICC stands for increased cost of compliance, for those things to make that home compliant, which you're going to have to do if you're having a substantially damaged structure. And especially now, since we've got these new effective flood maps, there are a lot of properties that are now not compliant. They were compliant when they were built, but they aren't anymore. They might have been in an AE zone and still in an AE zone, but their base flood could have increased, and so they're not compliant anymore. So that ICC coverage is something that I think you should encourage your property owners to think about getting when they are getting flood insurance. So I'm trying to look to see if there were some other points that we wanted to talk about with you today. Well, one of the things that we just wanted you to know that we're here to help answer questions for you and for your property owners. Austin and myself, and then there's two planners, Matt Stewart and Robert Goff, who all can answer some flood questions for you. We maintain flood elevation certificates here in our office. We have a lot, most of the historic ones. There's a few gaps of some ones where years ago, before they were all digitized in our old building, they were stored in the basement, which wasn't a good idea, and they got flooded. So we don't have every single one. And so, you know, if you have a property owner that's getting a new one for some reason, if you want to shoot it over to us, then we can save it and keep it in our repository of elevation certificates, and then we can have it in the future. So certainly you can contact us to see what kind, or if we have a flood elevation certificate, you know, on file for a property. So the three of the other handouts, or the documents that I shared earlier, were some kind of user documents that we created to help property owners understand what some of the requirements are in the AE, the coastal A, and the VE flood zone. And we hope that those will be useful to people if they're buying properties in one of those areas. So I'm sure there's some questions, and we're glad to open that up for questions now.
Ms. Carroll, if you want to unmute, I saw that you had a question about something that you wanted to ask. If you want to type it into the chat box, and then we can go, we can do that. There was also another question: are preliminary maps subject to change?
So when the preliminary maps are the maps that FEMA has published based on this new study area. So no, they're not really subject to change. Now, I did want to disclose, you know, the city of Jacksonville didn't adopt their maps. They're in an appeal process. And so there are a few areas right outside of the city that still aren't adopted that are in our jurisdiction because, you know, like I said, those flood panels are squares, and so they don't match boundary lines. So any of the areas that were part of the city that bled over into the county's jurisdiction still haven't been adopted until they finish that appeal process. But those preliminary maps that were published in, it was like in 2016, aren't likely, except for in the city, to change again before they're adopted. And it's at least a year or more is what I've been told by the state folks before those other ones get adopted.
Does anybody else have any questions? You guys can unmute and ask. Okay. I know Ms. Carroll is typing in a question. It looks like it might be a little bit of a long one. And thank you guys again for doing this for us. I know the last one that we did before the flood maps were adopted was great and very helpful. So if anybody wants to go back and take a look at that as well, I will share the link for our hub for the education site as well. So you guys can go back and take a look at that, as well as this one will be posted on that site as well, so you guys can take a look and rewatch, and like Shannon was saying, go back and take some more notes if you need to absorb some more information. Austin, did you want to send me that non-conversion?
That's one of those documents that I shared with you earlier.
Okay, perfect. Then that will also be linked where I post this recorded class as well, so you guys will have access to that. Ms. Carroll, are you writing a novel?
Yeah, that might be another thing just to let you know. Just like when you look at a property, if there's one or two different flood zones that kind of traverse the property, it's the most restrictive one. So if even just part of the house falls in that VE zone and most of it's in AE, the VE standard is what has to apply. So the 50% damage in the flood world is when it's considered substantial. So if once it's not over 50%, but at 50%, and we're looking at the structure only. So we use the tax information to get that. So the lot is subtracted out of that. You're just looking at the structure. So if the structure's value is 200,000 and it's been damaged such that the repairs are going to be 100,000, then that's going to be considered substantially damaged, and it would have to be repaired in compliance. If it's already compliant and they don't have to elevate, but there might be an elevation requirement at that point once they meet that substantial damage threshold. And that also goes for substantial improvements. And this is a huge deal as well. If you have someone that's looking at buying a property that's not compliant, it's an older home or whatever, and they're looking at remodeling the whole thing. Well, there's also substantial improvements. So if they go in and gut the whole thing and they reach that 50% value, then they're going to have to bring that into compliance. So they need to be aware of that at the very beginning. It may be that they need to stagger some improvements, and because for our ordinance, it's a 1-year look back period. Some localities have a 3-year look back period. And what that means is if they replace their HVAC and it was a $10,000 repair permit 6 months ago, and then you have a storm event, or even somebody's bought the property and wants to upgrade it, well, they're already at that $10,000. You're going to have to add that to, or subtract that from that amount that they want to improve, or it gets damaged, because that 50% goes back 1 year. So that's what that grandfather really talks about, means is the substantial improvement or substantial damage. Our lights keep going on.
Oh, we took those switches out of our offices because we would sit here and be working, and all of a sudden the lights go off. Carol did have a follow-up, but if the first sign of vegetation isn't within guidelines, they may not be able to rebuild, correct?
That's more of a oceanfront question, and we are we don't have any oceanfront property in the county. That's something for either North Topsail or Surf City to answer for you, because that's a CAMA question and not a flood question, really. And I don't know the answer to that.
Does anybody else have anything?
But again, like I said, if you've got someone that's going to get a flooded elevation certificate because they're just buying a property, if you want to send it over to one of us, or we have a land use email address as well. It's just landuse@onslowcountync.gov. We're glad to take that and save it in our historic documents, because it's good for us to have those, just for historic purposes. So the next owner that might want it, we'll have one on file. Because we're getting a lot of requests for those right now as people's policies are coming up to be renewed and they weren't in flood zone and suddenly they are, and they don't have an elevation certificate. And, that's how insurance policies are rated on those those elevation certificates.
Okay, well, if nobody else has anything else, thank you guys for helping us out with this. And if you guys, what was that land use email address again?
Land use together, like one word, at onslowcountync.gov. I think Austin's going to put it in that chat box.
Oh, you beat me to it.
Yeah.
Typing as you were talking. Okay. If you want to send me everybody's contact information of where they can reach out to you guys, I will get that populated as well. And then we'll get you information as we need to.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you guys for all being here. Let us know if you need anything.